Inflation, the general increase in prices, and the corresponding decline in the purchasing power of money is a phenomenon that reverberates through every aspect of the economy. Its effects are neither uniform nor predictable across industries. Rather, each sector experiences inflation in its own unique way, shaped by its cost structure, pricing power, supply chain dynamics, and consumer demand elasticity. As economies around the world grapple with periods of rising inflation, understanding its nuanced impact on different industries becomes essential for policymakers, business leaders, investors, and workers alike. At its core, inflation erodes the value of money. When prices rise, the same amount of currency buys fewer goods and services. For consumers, this means higher costs of living, while for businesses, it translates into increased input costs, wages, raw materials, transportation, and more. Yet the ability of a business to pass these costs on to customers varies greatly depending on the nature of the industry, the competitive landscape, and the price sensitivity of its customer base. The food and beverage industry is among the first to feel the pinch of inflation. This sector is heavily reliant on agricultural commodities, which are notoriously volatile and susceptible to external shocks such as weather events, geopolitical tensions, and global supply chain disruptions. When inflation strikes, the cost of grains, dairy, meat, and other staples often rises sharply. Food manufacturers and retailers must decide whether to absorb these costs or pass them on to consumers through higher prices. However, since food is a necessity, demand tends to be relatively inelastic. People cannot simply stop eating. As a result, food companies often succeed in raising prices, though not without consequences. Persistent price hikes can lead to trading down, where consumers opt for cheaper brands or private label alternatives, squeezing profit margins and intensifying competition among producers. The restaurant segment within the broader food industry faces its own set of challenges. While the cost of ingredients rises, so too do wages, especially in tight labor markets. Restaurants may try to offset these pressures through menu price increases, but they walk a fine line. Diners are sensitive to price hikes and may reduce discretionary spending or shift to lower-priced establishments. Moreover, the industry's high fixed costs, rent, utilities, equipment, leave little room for error. During periods of high inflation, many smaller, independent restaurants struggle to survive, while larger chains with greater economies of scale and negotiating power are better positioned to weather the storm. The energy sector, encompassing oil, gas, coal, and renewables, is both a driver and a victim of inflation. Energy prices are a major component of overall inflation indices, given their influence on transportation, manufacturing, and household expenses. When inflation is driven by surging energy prices, often due to geopolitical instability or supply constraints, the sector enjoys windfall profits, especially upstream producers and integrated majors. Oil and gas companies can pass on higher costs directly to consumers, who have little choice but to pay more for gasoline, heating, and electricity. However, the picture is more complex for downstream players, such as refineries and utilities. Utilities, in particular, are often subject to regulatory controls that limit their ability to raise prices, forcing them to absorb higher input costs and potentially impacting their profitability. Renewable energy providers face a different set of inflationary pressures. The initial capital costs for solar, wind, and other renewable projects are significant, and inflation can drive up the prices of steel, copper, silicon, and other critical components. Financing costs also rise as central banks hike interest rates to combat inflation, making new projects more expensive. However, once operational, Renewables benefit from low marginal costs and immunity to fossil fuel price volatility, offering a degree of insulation from ongoing inflationary spikes. Manufacturing, a backbone of the global economy, is highly sensitive to inflation, particularly through its reliance on commodities, energy, and labor. Rising input costs force manufacturers to make difficult decisions about pricing, production volumes, and workforce management. In highly competitive sectors, such as electronics, automotive, and apparel, passing on cost increases to consumers is not always feasible. Global supply chains further complicate the picture. Inflation in one country can ripple through to others, affecting the cost and availability of intermediate goods. Manufacturers with strong brands or unique products may have some pricing power, but those producing commoditized goods face margin compression and may be compelled to seek cost savings through automation, outsourcing, or process innovation. The construction and real estate industries are among the most visibly affected by inflation. Construction relies heavily on raw materials such as steel, lumber, cement, and copper, all of which tend to rise in price during inflationary periods. Labor costs also climb, especially amid shortages of skilled workers. These factors drive up the cost of new projects, leading developers to delay or cancel planned investments. For residential real estate, inflation often translates into higher home prices, benefiting existing homeowners, but making affordability a growing concern for buyers. At the same time, central banks typically raise interest rates to curb inflation, pushing up mortgage rates and dampening demand for new homes. Commercial real estate faces similar dynamics, with rising construction costs and financing rates weighing on new development, while landlords may benefit from the ability to raise rents, at least until tenants' budgets are stretched to the breaking point. The financial services sector experiences inflation in a dual capacity, both as a facilitator of economic activity and as a business managing its own balance sheet. Banks and lenders generally benefit from rising interest rates, as the spread between what they pay depositors and what they charge borrowers widens, boosting profitability. However, inflation can also increase credit risk, as consumers and businesses struggle to keep up with higher loan payments. Asset managers and investment firms face volatile markets as inflation erodes the real value of bonds and other fixed income securities, while equities may suffer if higher costs squeeze corporate profits. Insurance companies must contend with rising claims costs and the challenge of generating returns that outpace inflation, particularly in long-tailed lines such as life insurance and pensions. Retail, a sector closely tied to consumer sentiment, is highly exposed to inflationary pressures. As the cost of goods rises, retailers must choose between absorbing the impact or raising prices. Discount and value-oriented retailers often fare better during inflationary periods, as budget-conscious consumers seek ways to stretch their dollars. High-end retailers, by contrast, may see sales slow as discretionary spending falls. E-commerce platforms face unique challenges. While they benefit from lower overhead costs than brick-and-mortar stores, they are not immune to rising shipping, packaging, and logistics expenses. Retailers with strong supply chain management and inventory control can mitigate some inflationary impacts, but persistent cost increases inevitably force difficult trade-offs between margin preservation and market share. Healthcare is a sector where the effects of inflation are both profound and complex. On one hand, healthcare demand is relatively inelastic. People cannot postpone essential medical care indefinitely. On the other hand, the industry is heavily dependent on skilled labor, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and advanced technology, all of which become more expensive during inflationary periods. Hospitals and clinics may see operating costs rise faster than reimbursement rates, especially if government programs or insurers are slow to adjust payments. Pharmaceutical companies may be able to raise prices on patented drugs, but face pushback from regulators and payers. Medical device manufacturers, grappling with higher input and transportation costs, must balance pricing pressures with the need to innovate and invest in new technologies. The technology sector presents a mixed picture. Hardware manufacturers are exposed to rising costs for semiconductors, metals, and logistics, which can squeeze margins in a fiercely competitive environment. Software and digital service providers, by contrast, are less affected by material costs and may even benefit from inflation as businesses seek productivity-enhancing solutions to cope with higher expenses elsewhere. Tech giants with strong pricing power and recurring revenue streams are well positioned to weather inflation, whereas startups and smaller firms may find it harder to raise capital as interest rates climb and investors become more risk-averse. Transportation and logistics, the arteries of global commerce, face direct and indirect inflationary impacts. Fuel costs, a major expense for airlines, shipping firms, and trucking companies, rise quickly during inflation, forcing operators to adjust fares and freight rates. Labor shortages, exacerbated by wage inflation, add further pressure. Companies with flexible pricing models and efficient operations can adapt more readily, but those locked into long-term contracts or burdened by aging fleets may struggle. The ripple effects extend to supply chains. As transportation costs rise, so too do the prices of goods across multiple industries, amplifying the overall inflationary cycle. The hospitality and tourism industry is particularly vulnerable to inflation. As travel and leisure are discretionary expenditures, consumers are quick to cut back when faced with higher prices for essentials. Hotels, airlines, and tour operators see input costs, food, energy, labor, rise, but may be constrained in their ability to pass these costs onto price-sensitive travelers. Luxury segments may prove more resilient, as affluent consumers are less affected by inflation, but mass-market operators face declining occupancy rates and thinner margins. Inflation can also deter international travel, as currency fluctuations and higher airfares put pressure on budgets. Education, both public and private, is not immune to inflationary pressures. Institutions face rising costs for salaries, facilities, technology, and materials. Public schools and universities may struggle to secure additional funding from cash-strapped governments, while private institutions may be forced to raise tuition and fees, potentially pricing out students from lower-income backgrounds. Inflation can also impact student loan interest rates, increasing the long-term cost of education and influencing career choices and labor market dynamics. The agriculture sector, foundational to food security and rural livelihoods, is acutely sensitive to inflation, particularly through its exposure to volatile input costs: fertilizers, seeds, fuel, and machinery. While higher commodity prices can boost farm revenues, the benefits are often offset by rising expenses and unpredictable weather patterns exacerbated by climate change. Small-scale farmers, lacking bargaining power and access to credit, are especially vulnerable, while large agribusinesses may have more tools to hedge against inflationary risks. Professional and business services, law, accounting, consulting, marketing, experience inflation differently depending on their cost structure and client base. Firms with specialized expertise and a reputation for quality may be able to raise fees without losing clients, while those providing commoditized services face greater resistance. Wage inflation is a key concern, as skilled professionals command higher salaries, putting pressure on firms to improve productivity or automate routine tasks. Media and entertainment, reliant on discretionary spending, advertising budgets, and production costs, also feel the effects of inflation. As consumers cut back on non-essential purchases, subscriptions and ticket sales may decline. At the same time, content production becomes more expensive, with higher costs for talent, sets, and technology. Advertising revenues can be squeezed as businesses trim marketing budgets to offset rising expenses elsewhere. However, digital media and streaming platforms may benefit from shifting consumer habits as people seek affordable at-home entertainment alternatives. Mining and extractive industries, like energy, often benefit from inflation, particularly when driven by rising commodity prices. Producers of metals, minerals, and other raw materials see revenues surge as global demand outpaces supply. However, the sector is also capital-intensive, with significant exposure to rising equipment, labor, and regulatory compliance costs. The cyclical nature of mining means that windfalls during inflationary booms are often followed by downturns as supply catches up and prices stabilize. The nonprofit and charitable sector faces unique challenges during inflation. As the cost of delivering services rises and donations stagnate or decline, especially when donors' own budgets are squeezed, organizations may be forced to cut programs or scale back outreach. Inflation can also increase demand for social services, compounding the strain on limited resources. Inflation's effects on industries are further complicated by the responses of central banks and governments. Interest rate hikes, fiscal stimulus, subsidies, and price controls all shape how inflation is experienced and managed. Industries reliant on debt financing, such as real estate, infrastructure, and capital-intensive manufacturing, are particularly sensitive to rising borrowing costs. Conversely, sectors with strong pricing power, low capital intensity, or essential goods and services may fare better. Globalization adds another layer of complexity. Industries with international supply chains are exposed to inflationary pressures in multiple countries, currency fluctuations, and shifting trade policies. Companies that can diversify suppliers, optimize logistics, and leverage technology to improve efficiency gain a competitive edge. However, deglobalization trends, protectionism, and geopolitical tensions can exacerbate inflationary shocks, making resilience and adaptability more important than ever. Labor markets respond dynamically to inflation. In industries where unions are strong or where skilled labor is scarce, wage demands rise quickly, fueling a potential wage price spiral. Sectors with abundant labor or automation options may contain costs more effectively. The interplay between wage growth, productivity, and inflation shapes the broader economic landscape and determines which industries thrive or falter. Consumer behavior is a critical variable in the inflation equation. In sectors offering non-essential or luxury goods, demand is highly elastic, and inflation quickly dampens sales. Industries providing necessities, food, healthcare, utilities, enjoy more stable demand, but face political and regulatory scrutiny over price increases. The rise of private labels, discount brands, and alternative service models reflects consumers' efforts to cope with inflation, challenging incumbents to innovate and differentiate. Technology adoption accelerates during inflationary periods as businesses seek to offset rising costs through automation, digitalization, and process optimization. Industries able to harness technology, whether through e-commerce, supply chain analytics, or artificial intelligence, gain resilience and flexibility. Those slow to adapt risk losing market share and profitability. Environmental, social, and governance (ESG) considerations intersect with inflation in important ways. Industries facing pressure to decarbonize or improve labor standards must balance these goals against rising costs. Sustainable practices may entail upfront investments that are harder to justify when margins are under pressure. Yet long-term resilience increasingly depends on integrating ESG principles into business strategy. The impact of inflation on different industries is ultimately a story of adaptation and transformation. While some sectors suffer margin compression, reduced demand, and financial distress, others seize opportunities to innovate, capture market share, and build lasting competitive advantages. Businesses that anticipate inflationary trends, manage costs proactively, and maintain strong relationships with customers, suppliers, and employees are best positioned to navigate uncertainty. In conclusion, inflation is a multifaceted force that reshapes the fortunes of industries in diverse and often unpredictable ways. Its effects depend on an intricate web of factors: input cost structures, pricing power, regulatory environments, consumer behavior, global supply chains, and technological capabilities. No industry is immune, but the winners are those that combine agility with strategic foresight, leveraging their strengths to turn inflationary challenges into opportunities for growth and renewal. As the world continues to confront economic volatility, a nuanced understanding of inflation's industry-specific impacts will remain essential for informed decision-making and sustainable success.